They say Africa is full of life, but then you come here, where even the dust seems tired of surviving. Honestly, guys, I've never been one to fully trust the media, so I had to see the truth for myself. This is South Sudan, the world's youngest country in Africa, and perhaps the one the world forgot it brought into existence. I came to South Sudan to understand life in a country torn apart by war and meet the people who refuse to give up. Although one-third of its people have fled their homes, why and what hopes still survive here? Well, I'm about to find out. This isn't the kind of conflict you see in neatly edited news montages with violins and sympathy. It doesn't trend. Nobody hashtags it. Half the time, people can't even spell its name right. Just a nation trying again and again to exist while the world scrolls past. And curiosity always needs an excuse to wander, so I packed my camera and flew to a place the maps still argue about: Juba, the capital of South Sudan and of Central Equatoria State, a city that by all logic shouldn't exist, yet refuses to disappear. Upon landing in Juba, I underwent multiple layers of security checks and approvals at the airport. At first, the air didn't smell like the fear social media had warned me about. It smelled like rain that changed its mind halfway down. The tarmac shimmered like a mirage, and I remember thinking, so this is what forgotten looks like. Every surface here has a story, usually written in dust or bullet holes. Then the driver who picked me up laughed when I told him I was a visitor. "Tourist? You're either brave or lost," he said. I told him both. And I have to tell you guys about the heat here. It's so intense that it feels like a slap from the sun itself. I guess that's South Sudan for you. Half city, half dust storm. In a place like this, I was told I need a fixer, which is basically someone who keeps me on the safe side of chaos. It's not just helpful, it's survival. I mean, crime, kidnappings, and armed conflict are still part of daily life here. In fact, carjackings, shootings, ambushes, assault, and robberies happen often across South Sudan, especially here in Juba. So I met my fixer and translator, a Jack, who greeted me with a tired smile that basically said, "You're not ready for this." He handed me a short list of rules, as if my life depended on them. Rule 1. Don't wander at dusk. Rule 2. Keep one phone visible, the other invisible. Rule 3. Never make eye contact with a guy already holding a rifle. Rule 4. Don't step beyond the safe zones. And there were plenty more rules, each one making me quietly question my life choices. I promised to follow them, or at least pretend I would until things got interesting. From what I've seen so far, Juba feels like a city trying to hold itself together with hope and optimism. Most of the roads are muddy and unpaved, the streets turn into rivers when it rains, and every corner carries the mixed scent of roasted maize and diesel. I see people sell phone credit from wooden tables while goats confidently strut across the road like they pay the taxes. UN trucks rumble by, and boda-bodas, which are what they call motorcycle and bicycle taxis, weave between goats and potholes. It shouldn't work, but somehow it does. The thing about South Sudan is that everything looks temporary, even the sky. There's a weight to it, as if the clouds know the ground has seen too much. And that heaviness, it isn't weather, it's memory. The city feels like it's sprinting and limping at the same time. And sometimes it feels awkwardly silent. To understand that silence, I had to rewind to the night South Sudan's dream turned into its curse. From my findings, the story of this conflict began long before 2011, before the independence celebrations, before the flags were raised, and before the world cheered. It began decades earlier during the long, brutal wars inside what was then Sudan. A struggle for power, religion, resources, and ultimately, the right to exist. 2 long civil wars stretching across generations carved an identity built on endurance and survival. Then came 2011. South Sudan finally broke away, the world's newest nation, born in fireworks and promises. But within just 2 years, those promises began to crumble, and the country started tearing itself apart again. Politics became personal, and the personal turned tribal. By the end of 2013, people who had once fought side by side were now pointing their guns at each other. A vicious power struggle erupted between the Sudanese army and a powerful paramilitary group known as the Rapid Support Forces, RSF. They called it a political dispute, but in reality, it looked more like neighbors turning into enemies overnight. Tens of thousands have been unalived in just the first few months. And I think the worst part of this conflict is the meddling from wealthy countries, especially the UAE, who seem to have a permanent seat at South Sudan's resource buffet. And the fact that they keep sponsoring the RSF, honestly, is just insane. Millions of South Sudanese have fled their homes to nearby countries like Uganda, Kenya, and Ethiopia, carrying mattresses on their heads and fear in their hearts. In fact, between 2013 and 2018, hundreds of thousands of South Sudanese lost their lives. A peace deal was signed in 2018, but it proved to be little more than promises on paper, fading away like ink in the rain. But here's the harsh truth. Most people stayed after the peace deal. They built lives out of ruins and carved routine out of chaos. That's where I went next, the places people still call temporary, even though the years have quietly piled up. Camps that may look safe on paper, but in reality, feel suspended between survival and uncertainty.
Ajak and I drove to Mahad Camp, a place for the internally displaced South Sudanese where families live beside a graveyard because it feels safer than the towns they fled. Rhoda, mother of 4, tells me, sometimes we eat, sometimes we don't. There's no drama in her voice, just quiet honesty, the kind that makes your chest tighten. I watch kids chase a soccer ball made of plastic bags, their laughter slicing through the heavy air. For a moment, I almost forgot where I was. Across the road, a shiny new hotel stands tall for aid workers, air conditioning, Wi-Fi, and a perfect view of tents where people count meals instead of money. But amid the dust, mud, and diesel, there's something else that refuses to fade. Defiance. Because in every tent, there's someone still trying. Like the man I met, who was probably the only dedicated teacher left in the camp. Meet Call Anak, one of the few teachers still committed to working in a public school despite his meager salary. Most of his colleagues, he told me, have left to find better paying jobs with NGOs. But not him. He looked at me and said, "We teach because if we don't, who will build the future?" Honestly, guys, there's something almost offensively heartbreaking about how hopeful people can be when life keeps trying to cancel them. I met another man who fixed bicycles that probably hadn't moved since the last century. He called his workshop the Department of Motion. You can't make this stuff up. People here laugh at tragedy the way sailors curse at storms. It's how they stay human. But humor is only part of the shield. Faith carries the rest. Churches and mosques overflow with barefoot worshipers, their voices rising in melodies older than language itself. The words blur somewhere between prayer and protest. And yet, for many, even defiance has its limits. When violence returns, the choice becomes painfully simple. Stay and risk everything, or run and start all over again. I asked one woman if she believed peace would come soon. She smiled faintly and said, "Peace comes every morning and leaves by noon." I found that statement very deep. But defiance can only carry you so far when the bullets get closer. Eventually, some people have no choice but to keep running. And the road they take tells another story entirely. One of the internally displaced peoples, Tabu, told me she walked for 6 days with her grandson. They hid whenever they heard gunfire. Though she didn't call it gunfire, she called it rain. Because here, rain can fall from barrels. Children clung to their mothers while strangers climbed trees to hide. Those who couldn't run were unalived in attacks that erased entire villages. Today, more than 2 million South Sudanese live as refugees in other countries, while another 2 million remain displaced within their own homeland. We followed part of the route that many refugees take to neighboring countries, heading toward the border near Nimule, another town in South Sudan. The trail was lined with people walking, balancing bags, children, and sometimes even goats. There's a certain kind of silence that comes with displacement. It's not quiet, it's the absence of belonging. You hear it when someone says, "I'm going home," and you realize they mean a tent 3 countries away. One young man, Peter, told me he's been a refugee 3 times. He said, "I keep running into myself." He smiled when he said it, but it wasn't the smiling kind of story. Refugee camps across borders here all echo the same rhythm: ration cards, cooking oil, water lines, and the endless wait for news that never seems to change. And just when the world stops watching, another crisis spills over. When fighting broke out in Sudan in 2023, South Sudan suddenly became a refuge for the refugees, which is now ironic. By 2025, nearly 1 million South Sudanese had crossed the border carrying nothing but bags of memory. Aid workers were already running on coffee and exhaustion, and then the rains came, turning roads into muddy rivers. I asked one worker how he keeps going. He just shrugged and said, "If we stop, they stop." It wasn't a motto, it was survival in a sentence. But even survival needs a voice, because when no one tells the story, the world assumes nothing is happening. That's when I met Malish, a man using his camera to fight invisibility. This is Malish James, once a boy running barefoot from conflict, now teaching refugee kids to film their own stories. He tells me, storytelling keeps us human. Malish was trained by the World Food Program. Now he trains others. His students capture important events, market days, and the small moments of normalcy that feel like miracles when years have passed without one. He says the camera gives them control, a way to say, "This is me." And I realized maybe that's the most powerful thing in the world. That line stuck with me, because if stories can't be taken from you, maybe they can rebuild you. As I left the camp that day, I realized that the story of South Sudan isn't only about tragedy, it's about endurance, quietly disguised as ordinary life. South Sudan is heavy, not because of what it is, but because of what it could be if anyone actually gave it a real chance. Teachers stay when their paychecks don't, mothers trade water for flour, kids play soccer in mud that used to be a battlefield, and somehow the sun still comes up. I came here to see things for myself, to listen, to amplify, to remind the rest of us that hope is something people build with bare hands when no one else will lend them the tools. So if you can, support verified organizations working here. And if you can't help directly, then at least talk about it. Because oblivion doesn't begin with violence, it begins with forgetting. Now tell me, what would you do if your home existed only in memory? We need to talk more about this place. So kindly give this video a thumbs up to help create awareness. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications so you never miss more travel adventures, especially from places the world often forgets. See you in the next one.